Hello, Duval, parents and students. We're going to be talking this afternoon about some SAT, ACT prep and some information for it. My name is Andrea Talley. I'm one of your ELA specialists in the district for curriculum and instruction. I'll put our name at the end and some of the contact information if there's any questions that follow this tutorial. Again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. So we're talking today again about understanding the SAT and ACT reading assessment for our Parent Academy. I'm going to give y'all just a couple seconds here to kind of look through these true-false questions and kind of give yourself a self-assessment. Do you know the answers to these? So true or false? Some colleges prefer the SAT while others prefer ACT. The ACT is more knowledge-based than the SAT. The ACT is easier than the SAT. The new SAT is easier than the old SAT. And you can improve your score on both if you prepare yourself. Our first one is false. Both tests are accepted at all four-year colleges in the US that require standardized testing. The second one is mostly false. The ACT, SAT have changed over the years and become more alike. The third, also false. Although ACT questions tend to be more straightforward than SAT, the time pressure of the ACT is much more significant. Number 4, false. The revised SAT is harder in some ways and easier in others. And our last one is finally true. Studying and tutoring result in score increases. Often we get asked, what do these acronyms mean? SAT stands for Scholastic Aptitude Test, and ACT stands for American College Testing. There have been some changes in the last few years about what the score requirements are for ACT and SAT. We're going to start on our bottom section. So those who entered 9th grade between 2010 and 2017, that would be our current sitting seniors. So seniors who should be graduating this year in 2021, this applies to them only. Students can use the last adopted scores. Students must pass grade 10 FSA, ELA, or score a 430 on the SAT, EBRW, or a 24 on the SAT reading subtest, or a 19 on the ACT reading. So these are concordant requirement scores for graduation for our seniors only. The section on top is for our juniors and our sophomores and freshmen sitting in the buildings right now. So any students who entered grade 9 in the 2018-19 school year and beyond. Their scheduled graduation date would be 2022. Students can only use the newly adopted scores, so they cannot go back and use the scores that were permitted for this year and previous years for graduation. Students must pass the grade 10 FSA ELA. There is no or for this one. They must pass the grade 10 FSA. They need to score a 480 on the SAT, EBRW, or have an average of 18 on the ACT English and reading sections. So you might be asking yourself, which test is right for you or which test is right for your student? It's really just a matter of personal preference. Some schools and counselors encourage students to take both versions to see what they are best at. It's not, it's a good idea to do that if it's something that is feasible for you and your student. We're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the redesigned SAT compared to the ACT. The SAT is divided into 3 main sections: math, evidence-based reading, and writing and language. When I used the acronym EBRW earlier, that is what our score is based on, the evidence-based reading and the writing language section. Both tests have an optional essay. And the total time for the SAT is 180 minutes. That does not include breaks. It is broken down again into these sections. Reading, you will have 65 minutes with 52 questions. That is 75 seconds per question with 5 passages with 1 paired passage set. So that means that there are 4 different passages to read with one of those sets being paired. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. The writing and language, you have 35 minutes with 44 questions. That's about 48 seconds per question, and there are 4 passages to read. The essay, if you choose to do the essay, is 50 minutes for the 1 essay. A good practice for this is having students kind of do a drill or a speed test for themselves to see if they can answer when they're practicing questions in a certain amount of time, so they get used to these time constraints. The ACT is broken up into 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. Again, it has an optional essay. The total time for ACT is 175 minutes, so a little bit less time. That is 2 hours and 55 minutes, again, not including breaks. English is 45 minutes with 75 questions, which equals about 36 seconds per question, and you will have 5 passages to read for that section also. Reading is 35-minute section with 40 questions. That is 52.5 seconds per question with 4 passages and one paired passage set. And again, our essay is optional with a little bit less time, again, with 40 minutes. Neither of these tests we discuss the math time or the science for the ACT or SAT. So our SAT evidence-based reading test. It focuses on reading comprehension and understanding vocabulary in the context of the text. Each question will be based on a passage. One of the passages is going to be US or world literature. 2 passages are on history or social sciences. 2 passages on science, which may and usually do include graphs and or charts. So one of the passages will be literature-based, fiction, memoir, something along those lines. 2 will be historical, social studies-based. And then 2 will be based on science. Students will be tested on 2 primary skills in these reading passages: command of evidence, or the ability to find concrete evidence within the passage to support the author's claims or answers to specific questions. Students often hear this in their English class as evidence and elaboration or finding citations. So this particular command of evidence is going to be asking the students to do something they practice in their English classes quite often. Words in context. Ability to decipher the meaning of vocabulary words within the context of the passage and how word choice influences the style and tone of the text. So they'll have to define words through the context, through the words that are being used around it, as well as figuring out how those words influence style, tone, or meaning of the text. The SAT evidence-based reading tests broad skill question types, the big picture and little picture functions. The test asks students to find main points of passages. Sometimes it will have them focus on specific lines or sentences within a passage. Those are usually pulled out for the student and put into the question. Students must use contextual evidence to decipher either the author's overall message or the function of a selected area of the text. Students are going to be asked to make inferences or to infer, which means to interpret the meaning of a sentence, a group of sentences, or the entire passage. They're going to be drawing out meaning that isn't directly stated. Vocabulary and context, the meaning of a specific word or phrase within the passage. They're going to be asked about author's techniques to analyze the author's stylistic choices, tone, voice, perspective, etc. This is something students practice quite often, again, in their English classes when they're thinking about author's point of view, author's purpose, tone, things along those lines. Evidence and support. Students must locate contextual evidence for an answer to a previous question. In other words, these questions are directly related to the questions that precede them. To answer these questions, students must identify a particular line or group of lines from which they found the answer to the question. Data interpretation requires the students to interpret data, usually in the form of a table, chart, or graph, and understand how it relates to the passage. This is mostly going to come in the science passages, but it could also be in the social studies history section. The top 5 SAT tips for evidence-based reading. Students, these are things that students should be doing on their own while they're in school and just general practice for the SAT. Practice reading passages. Dedicate bulk of SAT prep to working with SAT-esque passages, which means they should spend quite a bit of time reading science articles, history and social studies, and fiction. Use the official SAT practice test created by College Board. Most students should be familiar with using College Board. It's something that's used inside the classrooms quite often, but they could also sign up for a free account. There are many unofficial and official SAT practice tests online that students can practice and get some hard work in. It's important to read more real-life texts from newspapers, magazines, news sites online from which SAT passages are often borrowed. Use the process of elimination. Don't be afraid. Students, you are allowed to write all over your SAT book. Don't be afraid to cross out answers that you know are wrong, so your choices are limited on what the right answer could be if you're stumped. During school, work at developing the skills to analyze vocabulary and context. If you're unsure, students, of how to do this, ask your English teachers. They'll be more than happy to help guide you in this particular section. For the writing and language section, it's often referred to as just the writing section. It's similar to the evidence-based reading section and revolves entirely around passages covering a wide array of topics, including careers, history, social studies, sciences, and the humanities. All passages in this are nonfiction. There will be no literary passages in this. This section measures students' knowledge and skills in revising and editing nonfiction texts. Grammar skills are going to come quite in handy in this particular section. Its broad skills and question types are going to ask you to have a command of evidence. The types of questions focus primarily on the big picture of a passage and usually ask students to provide evidence for why they are making a particular change. Words and context. For these questions, students must replace a word or phrase with a more logical choice or select no change if the highlighted area is appropriate as it is. This can be a stumping question for students because often we want to make a change even if no change is required. So be sure to look at the words around what you're being asked to change. Analysis in history, social studies, and in science. It requires students to read a passage about topics in history, social studies, and science with a critical eye and to make editorial decisions to improve them. That would include where to place punctuation, which part of a sentence should go first, active and passive voice, and things along those lines. Expression of ideas requires students to think about the various ways ideas can be expressed in words. Require students to rearrange, add, combine, or delete sentences to improve the overall flow of the passage. Again, your active and passive voice is going to come into play here. Students must correct incorrect, for the standards English conventions, students must correct incorrect words, phrases, so that they adhere to the basic rules of English grammar, punctuation, spelling, and capitalization. This is really just a grammar test for the students. If this is not something that students are used to practicing, I would really encourage them to have more practice in their grammar skills. The top 3 SAT writing tips for writing language. Master common SAT grammar and punctuation rules. Nearly half of all SAT writing questions focus on standard English conventions. This doesn't mean you must review every single grammar style rule, just the ones most commonly tested on SAT. Again, those SAT practice tests are going to come in handy for practicing these kinds of questions. Because none of the reading in this section are works of fiction, students should read real-life newspapers, magazine articles, persuasive texts, and essays. How does the author build his or her argument or the main point throughout the text? When teachers say to read on your own time, this is why. Hone your writing skills. Learn from feedback. Practice writing essays. Ask your teacher to go over it with you and get some feedback from them. Teachers are always going to be more than willing to help you when it comes to passing your SAT, ACTs. So for our ACT in English for section 1, you have 5 passages with accompanying 4-choice, multiple choice questions. That means each question will have an A, B, C, D. Students are the editor looking at a passage, making sure the grammar and punctuation are correct, and that the passage is well organized and rhetorically sound. You'll have 2 broad skill areas. Test the knowledge and usage of mechanics, grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, and so on. Basically, do you know the rules of the English language, and can you implement them correctly? Rhetorical skills, big picture ability to make sure a passage of writing flows, makes sense, and effectively communicates a point. The ACT is broken down into these sections, and we're going to go over some of the percentages of how each test asks you to answer the questions. Punctuation will be 10 to 15% of the test. That's 7 to 12 questions. These questions test knowledge on your grammar rules, the proper use of periods, commas, apostrophes, dashes, colons, and semicolons. If you don't know what these punctuation marks do, take some time and study them before your test. Grammar and usage, that's 15 to 20% of your test, 12 to 15 questions. These questions test knowledge of grammar rules, subject-verb agreement, pronoun use, modifiers, verb forms, comparatives, superlatives, and some idioms. If any of those words just stumped you, look them up, talk to your teachers about them, and make sure you practice those questions. Sentence structure is 20 to 25% of the test, 15 to 19 questions. These questions test understanding of the correct relationship between clauses, linking clauses to make clear, coherent, correct sentences, not fragments and run-ons. The sentence structure is going to be the largest part of your test. Rhetorical strategy is going to be 15 to 20% of the test at 12 to 15 questions. Strategy questions target students' abilities to build the clearest possible argument. Should the author add or delete a particular material, can students justify their decision in saying it should be added or deleted? Students consider if the material in question strengthens the passage or contains irrelevant information. You'll be making this choice in order to say if you should delete or add something. Organization is 10 to 15% of the test and is 7 to 12 questions. This tests the student's ability to build appropriate introductions and closing sentences for paragraphs and to choose the best transitions. Are students able to create a passage with clear structural signposts throughout? This comes into play in your writing as well. Think about when teachers ask you to write a topic sentence or an introduction paragraph or conclusion, or if you've gotten a lot of feedback on your essays in the past about your transition sentences and how to move from one thought to the other. Style is 15 to 20% of the test at 12 to 15 questions. Students are tasked with choosing the best words, phrases, and images to go with the passage's tone. Students correct sentences for excessive wordiness and redundancy. So students will be asked to take out words if things are redundant or too wordy. Students must be well able to identify a tone in a passage in order to be able to support it. ACT English Section 1 tips. Develop a passage strategy. Skim, go back and answer all the questions associated with that particular paragraph. Learn essential grammar rules about forming correct sentences, using proper punctuation, and especially the commas. Don't be afraid to select no change option. This answer choice seems like a trick, but sometimes sentences really are just fine. ACT reading are section 3. There will be 4 subsections. 3 of them will have longer passages, while 1 of them contains a 2-paired passage set. Four different subject areas. Prose, which is fiction or literary narrative. Social sciences, a nonfiction passage on soft sciences like psychology, sociology, and education. Humanities, a broad topic areas that include both personal nonfiction pieces like essays and memoirs, and also nonfiction pieces on the arts, literature, and philosophy. And natural science, nonfiction passages about hard science topics like biology, chemistry, physics, and medicine. So 3 of these will be longer passages. 1 of these will have a paired passage. In section 3, students are going to be asked to do these kinds of question types. 10% of their questions will be big picture, 4 questions about. It's going to ask students about the passage overall, the theme, point of view, purpose of the text. In general, students will be asked 1 big picture question about each passage or passage set. Details is going to be 38%, a fairly hefty amount of this test with 15 questions. Kind of little picture questions here. Straightforward information about small details in the passage. Typically easiest because they are literal questions which students can find directly in the passage. It makes it the largest portion of the ACT reading section. Vocabulary and context is going to be 10% of the test and 4 questions. These questions ask the meaning of a word in the context of a passage. Typically, students need to pick a synonym for a given word that still makes sense with the context in the sentence. So students are going to be asked to pick a similar word that has the same meaning that will not change the meaning of the sentence. 22% of the test, or 9 questions, are going to be development and function. These questions will test rhetorical analysis skills. Typically, students must determine the function of a particular phrase or paragraph within the passage. How is this argument in the passage developed, advanced, or how is this passage structured? Again, this is a skill that students practice quite often in their ELA classes. And then making inferences, 20% of the test with 8 questions. Inference questions ask students to make logical conclusions about something based on the information available in the passage. This is not subjective. The correct answer will always be supported by evidence directly in the passage. So a good way to look at this, students, is do your process of elimination, and then which statement is best supported by evidence in the passage, not just by your own thoughts or feelings on it. ACT reading, section 3 tips. Passage evidence. Questions may seem subjective, but all questions have one right answer, and that answer will always be supported by evidence from the passage. Develop a passage strategy. Helps to manage time more easily and find correct answers to questions. Skim glancing over questions first to see a purpose, but no close reading. So this is our scoring for the SAT compared to the ACT. The redesigned SAT score range is from 400 to 1600. 200 to 800 points, each for math and evidence-based reading scores, and these are added together. Evidence-based reading and writing are worth 1/4 of your score. Math is worth half. It's graded on a curve, set for each test depending on the level of difficulty. Most colleges superscore the SAT using the best section of scores from all test dates. That means that students are able to take the SAT more than one time and use their best scores. For the ACT, the score range is from 1 to 36. Students can score this 1 to 36 on each section. Composite score is the average of these scores. English, math, reading, and science are all worth 1/4 of your score. So all of those are equaled. Not graded on a curve. How well other test takers do will not affect your score. Your score will always be the same exact score you earn on the test. Most colleges do not superscore the ACT. They will use your best single test. So for the SAT, you can break down your sections and use your best score for each section. The ACT, you cannot do this, but they will use your best single test score. So you may retake the ACT. Literacy resources for parents. These are some really great resources, parents, to use with your students at home or students on your own at home in order to help you become a stronger reader and writer. Reading. Talk to your children and expose them to a variety of words. Ask questions about what your child is learning. The more communication, verbal communication students have, the better they become at expressing themselves and understanding what correct expression sounds like. Make reading a regular activity in the household. And reading doesn't always have to be picking up a novel and reading. It could be reading a blog post, an informational article, something in a magazine, newspapers. A sports article is just fine as well. Model reading for leisure. Encourage activities that require reading, like cooking and using a recipe book, or building something with a how-to manual. For writing, encourage your students to keep a journal. Letter writing, emails, pen pals, and thank you notes. Creative writing, such as songs, poems, stories, or comics. Responding to news articles and editorials. So after your student has read something in the newspaper or a magazine, have them respond by writing something about it. Writing to politicians or other social activism. This is a great time for students, especially with the elections coming up, to write to their politicians and other social activist platforms. Provide activities that relate to reading, writing, and to daily life, because that's why we test these things, because we use reading and writing in our daily lives. The FLDOE initiative, Just Take 20. So this is a program that encourages students to read. Parents are always the student's first and most influential teacher. They're only with their teachers for a few hours a day. Parents are always the most influential ones. Students need to read in all of their academic subjects, even including math. Students have got to read in order to be able to do the subject area. So if you go to the FLDOE initiative, Just Take 20, you can sign up and there'll be extra practices and some reading that parents and students can do together. As you can see over here on this side is where you can go to click on the different resources and to practice reading together as a family. Let's Read Florida helps parents and students with their resources, as well as reasons to read. Career readiness and preparing the student. This is something great for not only students who are thinking about going to college, but also students who think about going into a trade or career. This establishes work readiness behaviors and social skills. Practicing how to write a resume, complete a job application will help students with their writing skills. Interviewing and negotiating for a job will help them with their verbal skills. And Wakelet, you can use this link or the QR code to access resources we discussed today. So if you go back in the video, you can look at the websites, or you can just hold your phone up to this QR code with the camera on, and it will read this, and it will take you to a link where it has all of the resources that we gave you this afternoon. And thank you very much for attending our session today. Again, my name is Andrea Talley. You can contact us for any further information you might need. The phone number at our office is 390-2090, or you can email Fallon Rothenberg, myself, or Aisha Reese if you would like any more information.